is taking another hit from U.S. President Donald Trump's trade war. New tariffs announced last month are now in effect. They include a global tariff on 10% of all softwood lumber and timber entering the U.S.
And Donald Trump has also dealt another blow to the softwood lumber industry. A presidential proclamation set out a 10% duty on imports of softwood lumber to take effect on October 14th.
Lumber industry having to deal with the pain of tariff on tariff. A 10% hike on an existing 35% tariff, plus a brand new 25% tax on finished wood products. CTV.
It started with one loud promise. Donald Trump stood on stage and said America didn't need Canada's lumber. He claimed the U.S. had plenty of its own and that foreign suppliers were taking advantage of American workers. At first, it sounded bold, like a plan to make the country stronger. But what came next showed how one decision could shake an entire economy.
You know, if he can't get a deal, we have to hit back. Yeah. We just have to. And I'm not speaking on behalf of any premier, but my good friend Scott Moe, he has the uranium, he has the potash. The uranium keeps their 94 nuclear facilities going down in the U.S.
Could this be the moment the U.S. finally realizes its biggest trade mistake? The one move that quietly made Canada stronger than ever? Not long after that speech, Washington moved fast. Tariffs were slapped on lumber imports from Canada. The message was clear: buy American, protect American jobs. But the markets didn't cheer. They panicked. Prices for lumber exploded almost overnight, jumping to more than $650 per 1,000 board feet. One of the highest prices in years. And that price surge hit where it hurts most: the American housing market. Suddenly, builders were facing costs they'd never seen before. Projects that had already started were being paused. Construction companies couldn't keep up. Every piece of wood, every frame, every beam became more expensive. The math was brutal. When lumber prices rise, home prices rise too. Analysts warned that every $10,000 increase in housing costs could push millions of families out of homeownership. The irony was painful. The tariffs that were supposed to help American workers were now hurting American families. Lumber is one of the most important materials in the country's economy. From homes and furniture to schools and infrastructure, it's everywhere. And yet, the supply chain that kept it running had just been hit with a sledgehammer. Experts began to sound the alarm. The National Association of Home Builders said the plan might backfire. Economists at Brookings called it risky and short-sighted. What was meant to be protection looked more like self-sabotage. But here's the part no one saw coming. The real problem wasn't the tariffs themselves. It was what they revealed about America's hidden dependence on Canada. And once that truth came out, it changed everything. When Trump said the U.S. didn't need Canada's lumber, many believed it. After all, America has massive forests and plenty of sawmills. But the truth was far more complicated and far less convenient. Behind the bold political slogans, the numbers told a different story. The U.S. actually imports about 1/3 of all the lumber it uses. And here's the kicker: almost 85% of that imported wood comes from Canada. That means nearly every new house, school, or office building in America depends in some way on Canadian lumber. So when those tariffs hit, it was like cutting off your own supply line. Even if every sawmill in the U.S. ran at full power, the country still couldn't meet its own demand. Analysts estimated a shortage of over 3 billion board feet. That's enough wood to build hundreds of thousands of homes. And even if the U.S. wanted to ramp up production, it couldn't do it overnight. Most sawmills were already running close to full capacity, with many struggling to find enough workers. Equipment was outdated, supply chains were stretched, and the cost of raw materials kept climbing. Instead of independence, the tariffs exposed how dependent the U.S. really was. Meanwhile, construction companies were stuck in the middle. Builders couldn't finish projects on time. Home buyers faced rising prices. The dream of owning a home drifted further out of reach, all because of a political decision that ignored how deeply connected the two countries' economies really are. Industry experts began warning that this wasn't just a lumber issue, it was a wake-up call. America's drive for total self-reliance was clashing with economic reality. Some connections, they said, are too important to break. And as the U.S. struggled with its own shortage, something interesting started happening north of the border. While Washington tightened its grip, Canada was quietly coming up with a plan that would change everything. When the U.S. hit Canada with tariffs, most people expected a trade war. Many thought Ottawa would strike back with its own set of duties and punishments. But Canada didn't take the bait. Instead of reacting with anger, it responded with strategy. Prime Minister Mark Carney and his team decided to protect their industry in a different way. by helping it grow stronger and more independent. The government rolled out a massive support plan worth over $1 billion. The goal wasn't revenge, it was resilience. They gave money to lumber producers to modernize mills, invest in new technology, and explore new global markets. British Columbia, the heart of Canada's lumber industry, led the charge. Local leaders set an ambitious goal: shift at least 10% of exports away from the US and into new destinations. At first, it sounded impossible. For decades, almost all Canadian lumber had gone straight south to American builders. But now, Canada saw an opportunity hiding inside the crisis. They started viewing the tariffs not as a wall, but as a doorway. A chance to break free from over-reliance on one customer. With federal grants, trade missions, and new business deals, Canada began building relationships across Asia and Europe. Slowly, their strategy started paying off. While the US construction market was struggling with shortages and higher costs, Canada's mills were busy preparing for something new. A future where they no longer had to depend on one trade partner. They weren't fighting to survive, they were evolving to lead. This calm, calculated response surprised many economists. Instead of collapsing under pressure, Canada used the tariffs as fuel for reinvention. Their leaders called it turning pain into progress. And soon, that progress would start to show up in numbers, trade routes, and global influence. Canada wasn't just weathering the storm. It was learning how to control the wind. Once Canada decided to look beyond the US, everything began to shift. What started as a survival plan quickly turned into a full-blown transformation. Canadian lumber, once tied almost entirely to the American market, started flowing in new directions, toward Asia, Europe, and even the Middle East. Japan was one of the first to notice. Known for its strict standards and preference for stable suppliers, Japan increased its lumber imports from Canada by about 26% in early 2024. That move sent a message to the world. Canada could be trusted when others couldn't. Soon, other countries followed. South Korea, India, and the United Kingdom began signing new trade deals. Germany joined in too, praising Canada's focus on sustainable forestry. Suddenly, the same tariffs that were meant to punish Canada were making it stronger. The country's lumber was now seen as a premium, eco-friendly product, a perfect fit for nations pushing green construction. Canada leaned into that image hard, branding its timber as the green steel of the future. And that phrase stuck. At home, the changes were visible everywhere. Ports in Vancouver and Prince Rupert got major upgrades to handle the surge in global shipments. Forestry companies invested millions in technology that made production faster, cleaner, and more efficient. Each shipment leaving Canadian shores wasn't just a sale, it was a symbol. Canada was no longer just a supplier to the US. It was becoming a global player in its own right. And while Canadian trade was booming, the US was feeling the squeeze. The more Canada sold abroad, the tighter America's supply chain became. The balance that once defined North America's lumber trade was slowly tilting. And this time, it wasn't in Washington's favor. What started as an economic defense by Trump's administration had now turned into a global power shift. Canada was expanding its reach, building its brand, and proving that resilience could be far more powerful than retaliation. While Canada's lumber industry was booming, the situation in the US was falling apart fast. Builders across America were facing a nightmare. Prices were climbing, supplies were drying up, and deadlines were slipping away. Projects that had once been routine suddenly became unaffordable. The National Association of Home Builders warned that for every 1% increase in lumber prices, the cost of a new home went up by about $1,000. And prices weren't rising by 1 or 2%, they were skyrocketing. Lumber hit nearly $760 per thousand board feet, which meant an extra $10,000 or more added to the price of an average home. Families saving for years to buy their first house suddenly found it out of reach. Across states like Texas, Florida, and Ohio, half-built homes sat idle. Construction crews were laid off or moved to other industries. The ripple effect spread fast. Furniture makers, hardware suppliers, and small renovation businesses all felt the pinch. The promise of America First had turned into Americans paying more. Even worse, the U.S. lumber industry didn't benefit from the tariffs the way politicians had claimed it would. Domestic mills couldn't simply ramp up production. They were running on outdated equipment, short on workers, and burdened by high costs. Despite government protection, many couldn't compete with Canada's more modern and efficient facilities. The dream of bringing back American lumber dominance was fading. Economists began calling it what it was: a policy failure. Think tanks like Brookings said the tariffs didn't protect jobs, they just made life harder for ordinary people. Inflation crept higher as the cost of building and renovation filtered into almost every corner of the economy. In short, the plan backfired. America had tried to build a wall around its economy, but the wall ended up trapping it inside. Meanwhile, Canada kept pushing forward, signing new deals and investing in the future. By 2025, Canada's lumber story had completely changed. What began as a desperate response to U.S. tariffs had turned into one of the biggest success stories in modern trade. Canadian exports outside the U.S. jumped nearly 20%, opening new markets in Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. And this time, it wasn't just about selling raw wood. Canada was moving up the value chain. Mills across Western Canada started upgrading their operations. Instead of just cutting lumber, they began producing engineered timber, furniture-grade wood, and other advanced products that sold for higher prices overseas. These weren't the same old exports, they were part of a new identity. Canada was becoming a leader in sustainable building materials, a nation known for quality, innovation, and reliability. Major companies like West Fraser and Confor poured millions into modernization. They used the higher revenues from global demand to invest in automation, green technology, and eco-friendly production methods. Canada's government backed the shift too, framing it as the future of green growth. Suddenly, Canadian lumber wasn't just a product, it was a brand, a symbol of sustainability and smart trade. Economists at RBC predicted that if the trend continued, Canada could become the largest lumber export hub outside of Northern Europe by 2027. That meant overtaking countries that had dominated the industry for decades. And with every new shipment leaving ports in Vancouver and Prince Rupert, Canada's position in the global market grew stronger. Meanwhile, the US was still dealing with shortages, rising costs, and frustrated builders. What had started as a tariff meant to protect American jobs had done the opposite. It exposed how slow and outdated the US system had become, while pushing Canada to evolve faster than ever. The balance of power in North, America's lumber trade had flipped. Canada no longer needed the US to survive, it had become an independent force, setting its own course, shaping its own future, and leading a new era of sustainable construction around the world. And as the dust settled, one thing was clear. Trump once said America didn't need Canada's lumber. But in the end, it was Canada that didn't need America. What began as a promise to protect American workers ended up rewriting the rules of global trade. Trump's tariffs were meant to make the US stronger, but instead, they exposed its weaknesses. Lumber prices soared, homes became unaffordable, and the very industries the policy was supposed to protect were left struggling. Canada, on the other hand, turned crisis into opportunity. Instead of fighting back, it adapted, modernizing its mills, diversifying its markets, and embracing green innovation. In just a few years, it transformed from a dependent supplier into a global powerhouse. The story of the lumber war is more than just an economic lesson. It's a warning. Isolation doesn't always mean strength, and protection can sometimes become self-destruction. In the end, America's loss became Canada's breakthrough, and the message couldn't be clearer. In a connected world, resilience will always beat retaliation.